to bring us into how we got where we are right now and why we're doing the things that we're doing. So there's this connection between trauma and social justice that I kind of want to make as we have this discussion today. And I also want to kind of re-emphasize the importance of being intentional about how we do outreach, how we create space for people to heal, and how we address this issue in our community. I also want to say that our community is not monolithic. Black community is not a monolith, okay? We chose the word Black because of the diversity that we had within our team or within our staff at the sexual assault center. So when we were trying to arrive on, do we want to be African American or do we want to be Black? The people who were from Africa and the people who were Afro-Caribbean said, we're not African American, right? So it's not the same. Everybody doesn't have the same story. And so but we all kind of had part of the same journey. And that's where I'm going to share some of my personal story in terms of the journey. And how it played out where we were are all different based on what amount of power we were able to retain, what amount of equity, what amount of agency we were able to retain in those different spaces throughout the diaspora. But so we will be drilling down on what it looked like for African American slavery in particular as we go through the history of this, recognizing that there are other historical contexts within our community. Okay, so we know that there is a subculture to rape culture within our community. And so culturally, we may not all have the same experiences, the same exposure, or the same level of resilience, but we all have the same context for how we got here and the same kind of journey to a certain extent, right? And then from there, we move on. I love this Bell Hooks quote right here, which says, heightened awareness often gives the illusion that a problem is lessening. This is most often not the case. It may simply mean that a problem has become so widespread, it can no longer remain hidden or be ignored. And I think that's the space we're in now. And I don't know if you guys know who Bell Hooks is, but she's a Black feminist who's actually from Russellville, Kentucky. She's a local feminist, okay? So we like to give her some props for that quote and for it being right on target. So I am about to share my journey. Jordan, you can slide on to the next one. And so this is my story, which may be similar to many other people's stories, but it may be dissimilar in some ways too. Okay, so my journey started actually when I started looking into my ancestry and did the DNA test. I did the Ancestry DNA Test. And what you're looking at right now is my Ancestry DNA profile, okay? So if you look now, you know, I'm absolutely a whole lot of Black. It's a whole lot of Black in there, and it's all around the Horn of Africa. Probably my biggest three are Nigeria, Cameroon, and Mali. And then it starts to go down. So, you know, many of us are African mutts. That's what I call myself, because we have some of everything around that Horn of Africa where slavery was very prevalent. So all of those things are represented. So what I really want you to do is take a look at the European parts that are in there. Because when I took my test, I also had other family members take their test, which included my father, who's 90, and my sister and a cousin from my mother's side, so that we could parse out whose DNA was whose. That gave us a context for which side of the family things were showing up on. And so we did this, and when I looked at my DNA, you see I have about a 13%, 12% European profile in there, right? My dad's DNA, though, had about 25% European in his. So it was really a step down. It's beautiful how science worked. And what we knew about his grandparents is that they both were mulattoes. So if he stepped down to 25, that meant both of them were biracial. Okay, so they were both biracial. And so The other thing that DNA does, or Ancestry does when you do your DNA profile, is that they populate your page with other people who share your DNA profile. So when I'm looking at my page, I see a whole bunch of relatives I know nothing about. And when I look at my dad's page, I see a whole bunch of white folks that I never seen at any of our family reunions. So I did not know who these people were. So I'm like, Dad, do you know these people? I'm rattling off names. So he's like, I don't know those people. I'm like, Dad, they're your third cousins and fourth cousins. So your grandparents, who you are alive to know, should know who these people are. These are their people. Did you ever ask? He's like, old people didn't talk about that stuff, because they would have been 2 generations out of slavery. They did not have conversations about that. So there's a complete disconnect to all these white folks that were in our DNA that we didn't know. So slide on to the next slide, Jordan. So the other part of my journey, where it all kind of comes full circle, is 2 years out now, 2019 was 400 years, marked 400 years of slavery, of the slave trade. And so during that time, Ghana was having this big kind of, come on back, Black people, we're sorry, and like, come back home and let's reconnect kind of thing. And so I was able to take that trip right before the pandemic hit in 2019. And so what I loved about this trip is that when you go in and do these tours, right now we're at Elmina Castle in Ghana on the Cape Coast, or what they used to call the Gold Coast, is that they don't just give you a tour, they tell you the story, right? So he's in there, we're in there, he's telling the story, and he's telling the story of the colonizers, right? Who colonized first, and then kind of what the chronological order, let me get it right, chronological order of that was. And so he starts, of course, with the Iberian Peninsula, or he starts with the Portuguese, who were the first to begin the slave trade. Then it goes into the Scandinavians or the Dutch, and then it goes to the British, Irish, Scottish folks, right? So Jordan, go back to the slide we just saw. So if you're looking in my DNA, the Iberian Peninsula piece right there is the smallest amount of DNA from the European, in line with the chronological order of colonization. Next comes the Norwegians and the Germanic piece, okay? Again, in line with who was next. That would have been the Dutch and the Scandinavians, and then followed by the British and the Irish, right? All sitting in my DNA. So go back to the other slide, Jordan. Okay, so what we're doing right now is the gentleman is telling us the story of these colonizers and the order of which they occupied this castle. And where we're standing right now at the top is where the governors lived and the leaders of it. And what we're looking down into is where the female slaves were kept. And so what they would do is just, whenever they felt like it, just go down and get who they want, rape them, and send them back down. And so as I'm sitting there and I'm listening to him tell the story, and I'm remembering my DNA and all these people who I don't know showing up in there, and I'm seeing this on paper in black and white, this thing called ancestral memory just overwhelmed me. I had no idea what such a thing was, because I don't do spooky, but it was there, and it was overwhelming. And it was like, I could feel the trauma of the generations of Black women who I know came through this similar experience, right? And so sitting there, but the other part of that is, it was a duality of the experiences. And that wasn't just feeling the trauma, which I did feel intensely as he was telling the story. It was also an overwhelming sense of pleasure that I had as well from my ancestors. I could feel their presence. I could feel like they were saying, thank you for coming back, and thank you for coming back and reclaiming my identity and reclaiming my agency and reclaiming my power. I really felt bad sense, right? All at the same time that I'm feeling this trauma. It was something I had to go home and really kind of work through, because it was these two things that were overwhelming but beautiful. It was tragic, it was beautiful. And the resilience of the women that I know in my family and what they have overcome sat with me during that time and gave me such a sense of pride. And in spite of this thing, that these tragic things that happened to get us there. Okay, next slide. And so the next day, fortunately, we didn't have to just sit in that trauma. Our tour guide took us to this place called Adamawazi, where they actually did a renaming ceremony where they gave us back our name. They gave us back our agency. They told us who we were. And it was beautiful. And so that's me dressed by them and giving back my new name, Ama. Ama Ohima. Okay, so that was Queen Mother, and Ama means girl child born on Saturday in Ghanaian. So anyway, that is kind of my story and my journey of what this looks like. And while every Black person doesn't have that same experience, many of us do. Many of us have maybe not had the opportunity to go back and reclaim that identity and have that ancestral memory hit them in much the same way. But how we got here, that journey, and what's showing up in your DNA is pretty widespread. Okay, so with that, we are going to punt this over to Dr. Joy DeGuy, who has done excellent research around what we call PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And what she'll do is wrap up what I said and more in the research that she's done, and kind of give us a context for how it might look in our community.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Ptsd is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being Black? How does factoring in being Black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
I have to say that is definitely a very enlightening video. Listening to her speak, it makes me think about what resilience looks like in the Black community. And when I think about resilience in the Black community, I think about specifically Black women and how we constantly deal with chronic adversity and historical trauma and how that ties into epigenetics and things of that nature. And then we're often, you know, we're encouraged culturally to demonstrate resilience. And we typically make it look pretty. We keep on going. We kind of have that superwoman complex that this is the expectation from my family. This is the expectation from my community. As a Black woman, I have to keep going, because if I don't keep going, then, you know, nothing is going to move forward with my family or whatever. And so I think that it's very important that we have those outlets as Black women and as a Black community altogether. We have groups and practitioners such as Black Client Services with SAC, where Black women can come and unpack those things and address that trauma without having to explain, you know, the culture or their experiences or having to relive it. Because if you have a therapist or provider that looks like you, most likely they understand, even if it's from a different subculture within your culture. And so Black women typically experience a disproportionately higher rates of adverse health, physical health issues. There's a lot of misdiagnosed or undertreated mental health issues as well. And it's because having to go into those spaces that feel uncomfortable. There aren't many safe spaces, it feels as though, for us. And so there are, several websites that some people might be familiar with, such as Therapy for Black Girls. And then there are websites of hues of practitioners where you can go and find therapists that look like you. But that's also a level of privilege. When you are in a certain class and you have health insurance, or health insurance that, a lot of providers take, but you have the women that don't have access to health insurance, or health insurance that those specific providers use. And so I think it's great that we have Black client services, and there is definitely a need for nonprofits across not just Middle Tennessee, but across the country, of course, to address those things. And so I am happy to be a part of SAC, where we provide advocacy, and our team looks, diverse, and it's growing. And then we have the hotline, where we have a diverse set of people that answer calls. And we also have Black therapists, but there's a need for it because the Black community is in desperate need of healing. And one therapist or two therapists at an organization, or one advocate or a case manager or a social worker can only do so much. And then we also take on that vicarious trauma. And so we need our own therapist. And so I think that we can bring in so many different perspectives. And I just think it's amazing that, SAC is starting, in that direction. And so I kind of wanted to just share that overview of how things look on a macro level, and kind of transition into what advocacy looks like at SAC.
Thank you, Ariel, and please excuse my heater. I've been told it sounds like a wind tunnel. But I'm glad that Ariel mentioned the safe space part. We at SAC, we really try to make the entire organization a safe space for all clients. However, it's really hard for Black clients to trust really the system at large for several reasons. While it's not uncommon for any survivor to vent their worries or frustrations about police officers and criminal justice systems to advocates, it's very common for people of color to do so. Black clients and other clients of color, they still, even though they often report, they do so reluctantly and as a last resort. They're very often not really happy about reporting, but they just feel like they have no other choice. And when answering the clinic phone in the safe clinic that we have, I've received multiple calls from Black women wanting services, but feeling crippling shame or fear in receiving these services. Again, this is a trend I've noticed in a lot of survivors, but it's amplified in the Black women that I've spoken to. In addition to the shame and fear, they have little hope for police involvement due to previous experiences. I've heard from multiple times from Black women that they've had a police involvement for the same perpetrator or for different matters at large, and there was nothing done for their case. So how would this be different? How are we helping them be any different to their past experiences? This thought of, will the police help me, isn't unjustified. Research has found that while prosecutors file charges in 75% of cases which a white woman has been attacked, but when the Black woman has been attacked, they only file about 34% of the time. Older data has shown that for every Black woman who reports rape, at least 15 women do not report rape. So there is this trend, there's this very long-standing trend of distrust and feeling unsafe, even in this space that we're creating that is supposed to be safe. How this even more so impacts the clinic is that, I'm not too confident that survivors know that they can report to the clinic and receive services, advocacy services, without having to report to the police officers. I say this because as recently as last year, you have survivors coming in from other counties who are initially reported at a different hospital when the hospital called the police without their knowledge or without their approval anyways. So you can take this to mean that maybe our Black clients and other people of color assume this and are even more distrusting of coming into our safe space. And again, this distrust can be a system-wide feeling. It's not just limited to the criminal justice. There's a lack of overall representation in the SART, which is the sexual assault response team that includes advocates, SANE nurses, police officers in the justice systems. How that looks like specifically for Metro National Department is that there are no POC sex crimes detectives, and there are very few POC patrol officers. There are no POC SANEs and no male SANEs. So that also affects the Black male survivors. And we currently have no male survivors, and I do not believe we've ever had a POC male survivor. that's one of the reasons why we really need BSC to help build a space of trust for Black clients.
Yes, and so to sum up everything that my colleagues have said, it's a real thing. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is ever present in the Black community and also a lot of times normalized. And so that's why we have Black History Month, and that's why we have Black client services in these spaces to affirm the Black person, because we know that in America that doesn't always happen. There have been systems set up and put in place without all of our complex history in mind. And so we just want to thank you all for coming. Want to let you all know we have 2 more Black History Month events just to kind of celebrate and highlight our culture and the resilience that is Black people and the different hats that we wear. And I'm just going to show this really quickly. Tonight at 6 p.m., this is open to anyone, any race, gender, whatever. And this is a rape aggression defense class presented by the amazing Denzel Caldwell. And next Monday, we'll have an African dance fusion class. I'm really excited about that, especially the snow days. And I've been still a lot, so I'm excited to move my body, get it moving. So we just invite you all. I think that's on our Instagram and our Facebook. You can find the links to register for that. But that's all we have for you all. Thanks again for joining us.
Timing. That was amazing. It's like you guys did that awesome. Thank you so much. I know that the work that y'all have done has been eye-opening to not only our clients, our donors, to SAC staff and everybody. So I just really appreciate all the amazing work that you're doing and excited to be on this journey. For speaking of the events, so if you want to keep up with what they're doing, it's also on our website on the events calendar. You can always look. We try to add those as soon as we find out. We put them on the events calendar. So to those of you who do or do not have Facebook or social media, you can also go to sacenter.org and look at our events calendar and see all of the events and trainings that we have going on. We are so proud of everything that has been done in Black History Month, but our Black client services, we are always wanting to hear from them, and they do a lot of work in our community. So if you see them, just continue to encourage them. And SAC, again, is just proud to have this as part of it. And we hope to see you all next. Oh, thank you, Jordan, for doing that. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, or if you have any of the presenters, but I can definitely relay the message and then they will respond with any questions or follow-up. So we're 2 minutes over our time. Thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we will see you again in our next Lunch and Learn.